I will try and touch fairly quickly on just some key points relating to the question of what international law has to say about this fencing around the camps. And just to start off by acknowledging that, of course, international law is never a magic bullet. There are a lot of difficulties with enforcement. Nonetheless, I think it can be useful in advocacy efforts to be aware of what we can say about the different ways in which this fencing is illegal under international law. The first point that I wanted to make addresses the question of whether the Bangladesh government owes obligations to people who are living in the refugee camps, because I've often heard statements which seem to try and avoid responsibility, statements directed to the fact that Bangladesh is not a party to the Refugee Convention, for example, references to the fact that people in those camps are not Bangladeshi citizens. And so I just wanted to make the first point really clear that under international law, those things don't matter. There are human rights obligations, and those international human rights obligations are owed by a state to every human being in their territory and subject to their jurisdiction. And it doesn't matter what their citizenship is. It doesn't matter if they're stateless. It doesn't matter what their immigration status is. They are human beings and they are entitled to human rights. That's really clear under international law. Now, Bangladesh is actually party to a very large number of international human rights treaties. I'm going to mostly refer to obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but there's actually quite a lot of treaties that Bangladesh has signed up to, become a party to, and actually a lot of obligations which the government of Bangladesh therefore owes to people in the refugee camps. I'm going to just refer to a few key ones. There's obviously been some discussion in some commentary that's happened since the fires and about the fence more generally about restrictions on freedom of movement. There is a right to free movement. There is a right to be free from arbitrary deprivation of liberty. There is a right to be free from discrimination on national or ethnic grounds. Now, these things are all relatively simple to make arguments in relation to the fence, and I have seen some people doing them. Just wanted to highlight some other points which it's possible to make. Shafia has already spoken about a large number of different ways in which the fence has consequences for people's daily lives and their access to different services which are essential to them. Access to healthcare, access to the internet and information which might be difficult to gain access to from within the camps, visiting family members or friends in other camps, going to the markets just to obtain food or even livelihoods, rights of children to play and access educational facilities. These are all things which are covered by different human rights obligations. And if the fence impedes access to them, there are also arguments to be made there. I wanted to put a little bit more focus on two particularly important human rights, which I think are affected by the fence. The first one is the right to life. Often when we think about the right to life, we think about members of state security forces directly taking people's lives, shooting protesters, something like that. Now, that's just one part of the obligations that a state has in respect of the right to life. The other side of it is just as important, and that is a positive obligation on the state to make sure that people are not living in unsafe conditions. What's particularly relevant here is that there is quite clear guidance in international law that that obligation is heightened. There are more obligations on a state when it puts people in state facilities and keeps them there. And that includes facilities and camps for displaced people or refugees. So it's really clear that if the government of Bangladesh wants to force people to live in a confined area, what goes along with that is an obligation under international law in relation to the right to life to make sure that the conditions in that camp do not constitute a risk to people's lives. And there's plenty of discussion in international case law and guidance about the things that a state should be doing. And it includes things like the safety of the material that the shelters are built out of, the possibility of evacuation options and clear escape routes. So I think there's a really strong argument to be made, particularly in light of the fires, but we knew this already before the fires, that confining people in a restricted area is not a safe thing. The second important human right I wanted to talk about is the right to be free from ill treatment. It's linked to the right to freedom from torture. Ill treatment is just a less severe form of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. This applies under the ICCPR, Article 7. It applies under the Convention Against Torture. It applies under customary law. It's one of the most important human rights obligations that exists. And there is case law from international human rights courts that says that creating inhumane conditions, intolerable living conditions in refugee camps can breach this obligation. And if you look at some of the case law, I looked at one in particular that talks about camps in Kenya. The language that is used, the circumstances that they talk about are so similar to what you see in the camps in Cox's Bazar. The factors that they look at are things like access to food, to water, to shelter, appropriateness of shelter, overcrowding, sanitation, levels of crime, exploitation and abuse, risk of forcible transfer out of the camps, and whether or not there is any realistic prospect of improvement. Now, how is the fence relevant? The fence is relevant because, as Shafir has said, it exacerbates many of those conditions, but it's also relevant because the courts have really also focused on the fact that people can't leave the camps, that they have no choice but to be there. So I think there's also a really strong argument to be made increasingly that conditions in the camps really fall foul of Bangladesh's obligation to keep people free from ill treatment of this kind. Now, why do I say that these two human rights are particularly interesting? I think that they're particularly important because when I hear Bangladesh giving justifications about law and order, I think, okay, if we talk about restriction on freedom of movement is a human right that you are able to restrict to some extent. But if we start talking about the right to life, and if we start talking about the right to freedom from inhuman treatment, these are not things that you can answer by saying we're protecting your law and order entitlements, we're trying to make things safer. No, these are much more absolute rights. Okay, finally, because I think I may be going over, but I just wanted to make the point that I've been talking about international human rights law. There is an entire other body of international law which relates to international crimes. And as you would all know, the situation of the Rohingya people is before the International Criminal Court. And we have already done a filing before the court to highlight the fact that if conditions in the camp get bad enough, that those conditions could themselves actually constitute an international crime by authorities in Bangladesh who are allowing those conditions to develop. Now, obviously, erecting a fence does not itself alone constitute an international crime, but if you look at all the circumstances, the question is the level of suffering which is being imposed so severe that this becomes an international crime, and it could eventually be a crime against humanity. I'll leave it there, but I just wanted to say this was a very fast run through. I'm very happy to talk to anybody who wants more information on any of these legal issues. I'd be very happy to discuss directly. Thank you.